Symposium. I'm Dr. Angela Puca, Religious Studies PhD, and this is your online resource for the academic study of magic, esotericism, paganism, shamanism, and all things occult. I hope that you're ready with your questions and to fire up your intellect and trying to understand different forms of esotericism from the ones that you might be exposed to, because today we have a very special guest that I will now bring on, and that's Dr. Liana Saif. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much, Angela, for having me. I'm very excited to be here.
Oh, I really love your research. I'm definitely not an expert in your field, and that's why I'd love for you to speak about it on my channel. But I'm really impressed by your research and everything that you've done. And you can say a bit more about you. And you're a professor at the University of Amsterdam, which is very known as probably the biggest university and the only one, to my knowledge, that has an entire department dedicated to the study of esotericism and Hermetic spirituality, as Hanegraaff now has said that it's better for us to use that kind of term. So I was really fangirling over your research. So when I saw you in person at the conference of the European Society for the Study of Western Esotericism in Malmö, Sweden, I was like, how can I approach her now without sounding weird? Don't sound weird. And then I probably sounded weird.
No, you didn't. It was lovely to bump into you. And I'm very glad we get to have this chance to get to know each other a bit more, and for the future as well.
Yes, absolutely. So, Liana, do you want to tell us something more about yourself so that your audience can know you a bit better before we crack on with the difficult questions?
Sure. So I'm an assistant professor at HHP, the Center for Hermetic History and Related Currents. And before that, I was an associate researcher at the Warburg Institute as a part of the project, an ERC project that was actually based at the Université Catholique de Louvain and I was researching at that point Jābir ibn ḥayyān, who maybe we will talk a little bit about. And before that as well, I was at Oxford as a British Academy fellow, postdoctoral fellow to be more accurate. I was undertaking a project on magic in medieval Islam. So I was curious about the different trends and the different epistemological shifts that influenced the way magic in particular was practiced. But before that, I was writing particularly on the entanglement of Islamic traditions with Europe. But in the projects after my book, I focused more on the medieval context, but I often find myself back in the Renaissance, looking at Marsilio Ficino, Pico della Mirandola, Athanasius Kircher, and others. So I have many tentacles in different eras and different practices. But I also like to look at the reception of Islamic esoteric currents like Sufism, but not exclusively Sufism, on Western esoteric currents from the 20th century onwards, from traditionalism, the New Age, etc. And if anyone has any more questions about my history, I'm happy to answer.
Yes, of course. And in our conversation, we realized that there are some terms that need a bit more clarification before we crack on with our conversation, because these are not commonly known qualifiers. So could you explain us a little bit the difference between Islamic, Islamicate, Arabic, esotericism, occult sciences, these terminologies that are used in reference?
I hope you have time. I'll be brief. So as we were saying, Angela, I think it's always helpful to start with just unpacking the qualifiers that I use, just to avoid confusion. So, for example, the term Islamicate in particular, it's a term that was coined by a prominent historian of Islam called Marshall Hodgson, particularly in a multi-volume text called The Venture of Islam, which was published in 1974. And it is used in this context to describe cultural and intellectual aspects that developed in connection or in the context of Islamic civilization, but may not be necessarily religious in nature or might not have been articulated by Muslims. So basically it includes a broader cultural and intellectual activities that have been shaped by Islamic thought and practices, but might not in themselves be religious. So the example that I give is that one of the most influential authors on astral magic, but particularly talisman, is Thabit ibn Qurra, who was a Sabian and not a Muslim. So in this context, Islamicate, I think, works for me. And then when we use Islamic, in general, it refers to anything directly related to Islam as a religious tradition, including its beliefs, practices, institutions, laws, etc. The lines between Islamicate and Islamic can be blurry. So this forms part of an ongoing conversation in unpacking these terms, and just to understand the relationship between intellectual production by non-Muslims, such as Christian and Jewish agents, within an Islamic civilization, Islamic culture. Arabic is different because it is used in two types of way. It is an ethnic marker, and in the Islamic and Islamicate context, not everyone were Arabs. There's a lot of Persians and very influential Persian astrologers, for example, but not just Persians, but other also ethnicities. But we can also use the term Arabic to refer to the lingua franca and the language of intellectual and scientific production, which indeed in the medieval era, particularly before the 12th century, was the language of science. But again, that is not to say that people only wrote in Arabic, but this is one way so that people know what we mean when we say Arabic, that it's not necessarily an ethnic marker.
Yes.
As for, should I go more with the occult or esoteric, or would
Yeah,
that be...
to understand the difference between occult sciences and esoteric, if there is a difference in that kind of context.
Yeah. Also, I think this is a very good binary to unpack together. So I rely in my definitions on the writings themselves, on the authors themselves. And of course, translation presents, as you know, a lot of gray areas. So, but the way that I distinguish them on the basis of the sources that I use is that occult for me is an ontological category. And that basically means the nature of something. So the occult sciences become those sciences that deal with phenomena whose causes are not immediately available to the senses. So with astrology, it's astrological influences. We see their effects, but we don't necessarily experience their causes immediately or immediate to the sense. For magic as well, talismans, how they work, the occult properties of things, these occult properties that, you know, distinguishes the use of copper for certain purposes, but not lead for other purposes. These are properties that are inherent in natural things, but they're not immediately available to the senses. So in that sense, the occult has also traditionally included medicine, surprisingly, because medicine deals with symptoms or deals with causes that are hidden based and then producing knowledge based on their symptoms. So in that sense, they're occult, and the Arabic word for occult in this sense is khafi, to be hidden. Esoteric, on the other hand, is more or less an epistemological category, which means how something is understood or the knowledge approach to understanding it. So the esoteric is a position of interpretation and explanation, interpreting phenomena exegesis in order to seek their divine causes or their divine origins, and attain a connection with it, so to speak. Obviously, this is quite a reduction to it, but it reflects also the Arabic use of batin, the word batin, which means something hidden, something beneath, and even like the belly button, like, yeah. So in that sense, not everything occult is esoteric, and not everything esoteric is occult. So you can practice astrology in a way that is non-esoteric. For example, Abu Ma'shar al-Balkhi, very important astrologer, very, very influential in the Islamicate context and in the Latinate context and in the Western context. If you look at the astrology there, it's about technique, it's about predictions, it's about the symptoms and how to interpret signs in nature and the heavens of things that are hidden, astral influences that are hidden. But you can also see astrology used, for example, by Sufis that will take an esoteric sense, where astrological knowledge is not just about finding out what was just hidden, but also it becomes a knowledge for attaining proximity with the divine. So this is like the basic distinctions that I make based on the sources that I study.
Thank you. And by the way, hi, Philip, dear friend of mine who is a great resource online for the study of everything Islamicate and Islamic tradition.
Yeah.
So nice to see you here in the chat. But one thing that I was thinking about is how come I tend to, or is it, if it is my ignorance, please correct me. But my impression is that in the field of Esotericism, I hear about the term occult science primarily when it comes to the Islamicate word. Is it just my impression? I don't think that I hear as much.
That's a very good observation, Angela, because I think this leads us to the notion of science, right? So in the Arabic, it's the occult sciences because it's ulum khafiyya, literally translate as the sciences of things occult or things hidden. And what's important here to highlight is that the occult sciences have become really branches of natural philosophy. They are the sciences whereby we apply knowledge of the cosmos and of nature. So other natural sciences, natural philosophy is going to explain phenomena in the different layers of the cosmos, nature, the celestial world and the divine world. You will read a lot of like Aristotelian notions of generation and corruption, how things come generated and how things dissipate, but also the Neoplatonic emanation scheme. So this is natural philosophy. But the occult sciences, they become the application of that knowledge in life to make things happen for the benefit of human beings. Well, depending on the perspectives, because sometimes magic is not for the benefit of anyone. But that's why I think it's important to stress the fact that in the context that I look at, in the medieval context particularly, but also in the early modern context, these are part of natural philosophy, and that's why they become very attractive in the European context, right? And we can talk a bit about it a little bit more if you want. In the context of the medieval Latin world, this demonizes magic, right? It stops being about demons and it starts being about natural dynamics, and that helped make the natural world more knowable and more defensible, I think, in practice.
So could you elaborate a bit more about the influence of the Islamicate? I'm gonna use Islamicate because I'm scared of using the wrong term. But so also another thing that I was thinking. So would it be correct to say that Islamicate means culturally Islamic, but not necessarily yet possibly religiously Islamic?
Yep.
Is it correct? Okay.
Yep, it is correct.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
Again,
I don't know that I have understood the definition.
No, you have. You have. I mean, there's always more ways to nuance things, of course, but I think at its core, that is absolutely correct. Yeah.
Yeah, because if it also includes the religious Islamic, then it is the most all-encompassing term. So
Yes.
yeah, that's good to know. So
Exactly.
I'm gonna use that one.
Go for
it. Can you tell us a bit more about the definitely significant influence that the Islamicate word and the Islamicate traditions have had on the development of what we now understand as Western Esotericism? And when did it
Sure.
start, and who were the main contributors and the main influencers? That's an
Yeah, sure.
anachronistically applied term, but
No, that's absolutely fine. So in order to talk about these influences, I think it's important to go back to the 12th century in Europe, and the 12th century at that time was going through a lot of intellectual and economic changes as well. So and one aspect of that was the development, obviously, of cathedral universities in Paris, Montpellier, Oxford, Salerno, Bologna. And in the context of the universities in these developing urban centers were very important for one, translating Arabic sources, because they were feeding the curricula at that time, particularly the natural philosophy and the natural sciences. And it led to what Charles Haskins described as the Renaissance of the 12th century. And that's when the Arabo-Latin translation movement happened. So Arabo-Latin because it's from Arabic into Latin. And that happened particularly in the 12th century. And there was notable centers around Europe, Toledo, Sicily as well. And it involved Jewish scholars often who served as culture and linguistic intermediaries. And there were very famous translators of that time. For example, Hugo of Santella, who was Spanish, Daniel Morley, who was English, and Gerard of Cremona, who arguably is one of the most accomplished translators of scientific texts, who was active in the late 12th century in Toledo. And he particularly translated lots of the Arabic works of Ptolemy, like Al-Majest, and other texts that became very influential on astrological practice, like Al-Farganus, Elements of Astrology.
Can I just please interrupt you for a second?
Sure.
May I ask you to take off the necklace, because it's hitting on your microphone?
Ooh,
and we
okay.
cannot.
How about this? I will do this.
Oh yes, that's okay too. It's just that when it clashes on the microphone, we can hear a clicking sound and we can't hear your voice. So that's why.
I am so sorry.
No, that's fine. It happens.
Solve the problem. I will. Yeah, no worries. So you had, these celebrity translators basically who were translating a lot of works on astrology, on medicine, and natural philosophy. But also you had a lot of patronage. For example, King Alfonso X. He gathered around him a learned community of Muslim, Christian, and Jewish scholars, and he basically had what we refer to as a scriptorium that he commissioned for a series of translations, mostly on astrology and magic. So this is more like the practical side of how this material entered. But I think in terms of the intellectual value and the scientific value, the Arabic materials on astrology, medicine, and natural philosophy basically promoted a worldview that became more knowable, more intelligible. The cosmos became more knowable, more intelligible. Now, that is not to say that before that people did not think or did not know things about the universe, but it was quite a wealth of information that provided an anatomy of the cosmos in details that were not you cannot be matched with the texts or the knowledge available before. And so you have text on astrology that provided theories on astral influences. So how do the stars influence the terrestrial world? And particularly this notion that the Islamic texts were emphasizing, which is causality, that this is the activity of the stars and their influences on the terrestrial world was not random. It was basically because the stars acted as causes. And in this sense, they were using Aristotelian ideas of causes. And just to get a little bit more technical, but Aristotle posits four causes: the form of something, the matter from which the something is made, and then the agent that made that thing, and then the purpose of that thing. And astrologers such as Abu Ma'shar al-Balkhi particularly proposed that the stars were the efficient causes, the agent cause that brings form and matter and thus generates the thing. And this might sound a little bit basic to us, but that basically helped to, as I mentioned earlier, demonize astrology, astral influences, and magic. But I think it's also important to look at the influence of medicine. We mentioned earlier that medicine in some texts was considered an occult science. But the medicine and medical texts, whether they were translations of Galenic text, they basically provided the intelligibility about the human body. And as a result, when the stars became knowable, the body became knowable, they were connected. So the notion of the microcosm became now established even more as the body of the human, and the being of being human is a microcosm of a macrocosm, because the macrocosm caused the microcosm, which is the human. So that became a really important point of influence that runs through the Renaissance as well. And so in very general terms, I think this intelligibility, this integration of causal way of thinking was very important, and were integrated into medieval universities where in some ways it was described as physica. So it's not physics, but physica is kind of like the study of nature and the study of the connection with the celestial world on the basis of understanding causes and effect in a Neoplatonized Aristotelian type of way, if that makes sense.
That's very interesting. So there clearly was a very big influence. And do you think that there's something that is particularly surprising or little known about the Islamicate influence on what we now call as Western historicism, but we know it is a 19th century category that has been applied retroactively, that most people will not be aware of?
The most surprising thing about
or little known, yeah,
or little known, I think it's in things like when prominent theologians, Christian theologians are talking about the occult sciences. I think oftentimes that seems to be quite surprising. For example, Thomas Aquinas. Indeed, I wouldn't say that he was an occultist by any means, but in his works, he often talked about the different ways in which occult properties were interpreted, and commented on the validity of some of the arguments that were taking place with regards to the naturalization of astrology and magic. Oftentimes to assert that, for example, any kind of divinatory practice involved demons. So he was not necessarily approving of all the theories that naturalized astrology, for example, other divinatory practices, but he had the open mind to write about the nature of occult properties of natural things. arguing, for example, that certain materials did have certain occult properties and occult powers, but, and that's important, as long as you don't add things on that object that might make the object addressative. So addressative, I use it in the sense that it seems to be addressing a power that listens. So whether it was demons or not, I think that often surprises people. Is theologians who we often assume are not involved in this kind of knowledge were actually quite involved in them as well.
Yeah. And also, I think that the knowledge in those centuries was really almost precluded to people that were in some kind of religious capacity. So it kind of makes sense in that sense. But how did the translation movements, and particularly during the Renaissance, transform Western esoteric thought through these Islamicate texts?
I guess in the Renaissance, one way that I think can be challenged about the way that we think about the Renaissance is that it was a cutoff point. But a lot of the Arabic influences continued quite seamlessly into the Renaissance. But what was different in the Renaissance is that there was, because of the name Renaissance, right? And it's a rebirth, and particularly a rebirth of Greek knowledge, and so there was indeed the sense that the Greek material had to be translated into Latin directly, but to exaggerate that the people in the Renaissance were bypassing the Arabic material is incorrect. I think the Arabic material remained to be very influential, particularly in their commentary forms, and again, this idea of naturalizing the occult sciences. And for example, the Marsilio Ficino, who we talked about, integrates a lot of this material. For example, he refers to Abu Ma'shar al-Balkhi, who arguably is the first to articulate a theory of astral influences based on Aristotelian notions of causality. And that remains quite important for someone like Marsilio Ficino, Pico della Mirandola, or Heinrich Agrippa and John Dee, who read these texts, who knew the Picatrix, who I think we're going to talk about a little bit more later. And so this idea of the stars acting as causes and therefore making talisman is a reproduction of a natural process was very influential in the Renaissance as well. And we see also that in the way, for example, Marsilio Ficino talks about medicine and making, for example, in his 3 books on life, when he talks about making these pills for diseases, he speaks about these medicines in terms of occult properties that exist in these material because of these astral influences. That's why they need to be astrologically timed. And in that, he proposed a model where it's not about demons, but rather it's about astral influences and the emanations of the cosmos.
That's very interesting. And I think it would be a great idea to talk a bit more on about the Picatrix. I think that your work on the Picatrix is definitely groundbreaking. So what are the most intriguing aspects of these texts that challenge our contemporary understanding of magic and astrology?
I think it has to do with the point that you made earlier when you asked about sciences. These were, I think the fact that they were considered natural sciences rather than a marginalized or illegitimate knowledge. It was quite mainstream. That does not mean that there were no negotiations. There was a lot of works that aimed at differentiating between the different types of practices, the different types of magic, for example, that are legitimate and that are not legitimate. And as you would expect, it goes around the idea of like, is it demonic agency, or is it natural or astral agency? But it's still considered natural sciences, and you have prominent philosophers who were not occultists, like Ibn Sina, who classified them as natural sciences. I think also another aspect that might be little known, or rather surprising and important to emphasize, is that, you know, in the medieval period that I focus on, the dominant model for understanding the occult sciences was indeed natural philosophy. But with the rise of Sufism and its institutionalization, particularly in the 12th and the 13th century, another competing model for understanding occult influences emerged. And that one is more esoteric, right? So, and in that context, the occult knowledge or magical knowledge is not necessarily based on intellectual engagement with the cosmos. And I mean by that, studying causality, understanding natural dynamics, but becomes the prerogative of the spiritual elite, right? And it becomes knowledge that is given by God to the spiritual elite as a sign of confirming their development in the esoteric path. And what is surprising is that I talk a lot, at least, about Ghāyat al-Ḥakīm and the Picatrix. But if you go further in time, you will find that it has much less influence in the early modern period and onward in the Islamicate context here. I'm particularly talking about the Islamicate context here. In the early modern period, it stops being so influential, and another occult science based on Sufi cosmology comes to the fore, and that's the science of letters and divine names, which is to this day practiced. So if we come to modernity, the astral magic of Ghāyat al-Ḥakīm or the Picatrix or the Brethren of Purity or other authors and works on astral magic actually stop becoming so influential, and you have letterist treatises and letterist magic becoming more influential. And I'm sure a lot of your audience, and you know about Ahmed al-Buni, who became like the arch sorcerer with quite a grim reputation, that unfairly so, that became associated with the science of letters and divine names. And to this day, as I said, that becomes the more prominent practice, Islamic practice.
Can you tell us a bit more about him and about this, this practice and the text surrounding this practice of the divine names?
Yeah, of course. So the science of letters and the divine names can be compared, for the sake of just clarity, to Kabbalah, and it proposes that the different components and layers of the universe have essences that are based on letters and God's attributes, so his divine names, and that an esotericist is able to induce effects in the celestial world, in the natural world, and in their psychology, based on the manipulation of letters and divine names. And although there are many letterists that we can mention, but the most prominent author, as I mentioned, is Ahmed al-Buni, who was active in the 13th century, perhaps died in 1225. But not much is known really about his life, other than he was North African and that he was active in Cairo, but also that he was a Sufi who was known to perform miracles. But his identity quite early on was a little bit obscure. But nowadays he is known as like an infamous sorcerer, based on a text called Shams al-Ma'arif al-Kubra the Sun of Knowledge, the larger version. And this text turns out to be based on the studies of Noah Gardner and Jean-Jacques Coulon. It turns out that this text that we have always thought to be an authentic text by al-Buni is not actually by al-Buni, but rather a 17th century production of probably adherents of al-Buni type esotericism that more emphasized the occult more than the way that you see in al-Buni's authentic texts. And his work continued to be influential, but also controversial to this day. But you know, he's not the only author who's written on this, but he became very central in especially and even in modern culture. And in the last, I would say, 5 years, he became very prominent, and the text Shams al-Ma'arif became very prominent, especially that it was translated recently by Amina Enlos in a modern edition. It's incomplete, but that offered a great gateway for modern practitioners and also academics to get into the science of letters and divine names, which, as I said, correlates the letters of the Arabic alphabet with the hierarchy and the emanations of the universe as decreed by God. But the knowledge of the divine letters and the letters and the divine names is not attained by processes of understanding nature, but rather by pursuing an esoteric path. And it gets revealed to esotericists in, if you will, like a heightened spiritual state.
This is very interesting, and it's something that is found in other traditions too, like in Jewish mysticism and also in Indian mysticism. With I'm thinking about Tantra and the Spandakarika in Kashmir Shaivism. You also have that kind of. But what's the most controversial thing about these texts and the alleged author?
I think the most controversial aspect is the jinn and the demons. So in the context of astral magic, the jinn is generally absent and demons are generally absent. You know, the Picatrix and Ghāyat al-Ḥakīm and other texts, they speak about spiritual forces, but these spiritual forces are usually tied in to the influence of the stars rather than them being demonic entities. So they're called ruhaniyat. And of course, the term ruhaniyat, ruh, means soul. It indicate a kind of entity. But if you read the Ghāyat al-Ḥakīm and the Picatrix, the author explicitly says that we're not talking about jinn and we're not talking about demons. We're talking about kind of like the volitional network of the cosmos that basically stems from God's own decrees. But by the time we get to the Shams al-Ma'arif and the time we get to the science of letters and divine names, they become more prominent. And it makes sense because the idea of the science of letters and divine names is to manipulate or hold power of letters in a way that is able to dominate and control different layers of reality. And that, of course, includes jinn and demons as well. So that really what gave it its dark reputation. But if you ask someone, for example, I'm now in Jordan, if you ask someone about the Shams al-Ma'arif, and they will tell you that just owning the book is unleashing demons and jinns. So there's a lot of narrative, what I call narratives of danger about these types of texts, rather than, for example, Ghāyat al-Ḥakīm or the Picatrix, because the Ghāyat al-Ḥakīm explicitly says as well and emphasizes that alchemy and astral magic are parts of natural philosophy. And I guess this, and I think it would be interesting, since we're talking about the influence of the Arabic material in European and then later the Western context, it's worth mentioning that in the Renaissance, No, before that, in the 13th century, Alfonso X, who I mentioned earlier, he sponsored the translation of the Ghāyat al-Ḥakīm, first into Castilian and then into Latin, and there was also a Jewish translation. But it really gets picked up in the Renaissance as well. But in the Renaissance, in the European Renaissance, that was the time when the science of letters and divine names in the Islamicate context was more prominent. And so one of the questions that I've asked is that where is the science of letters and divine names in the Renaissance? And you don't find it so much in Ficino or in Pico della Mirandola, where you find the Kabbalah, obviously, being more prominent in these sources. But in a recent work that I've conducted on Athanasius Kircher, he refers to a peculiar type of Kabbalah in his Oedipus Aegyptiacus, curiously called Kabbalah Saracenica. So the Kabbalah of the Muslims, and the Saracen is a pejorative term that was used in the medieval period, but also in the Renaissance to refer to Muslims. And so he refers to this as Saracenic Kabbalah. So he saw in the 17th century that there is a similarity between the science of letters and divine names and the Kabbalah. And then upon looking at his sources and digging around archives and identifying some of his sources, it turns out that he was reading legit text on the science of letters and divine names, and trying to systematize them in some way. But he considered it as an inferior form of what he called Hebrew Kabbalah. So this is a fascinating instance of actually the European reception of the science of letters and divine names. We don't find Al-Buni, although I tried so much to look at the Oedipus Aegyptiacus and other texts as well to find a reference to Al-Buni or someone who maybe sounds like Al-Buni, because in truth, Kircher did not necessarily transpose the names quite accurately a lot of the time. So I was looking for Al-Buri, Al-Buni, or whatever, and I couldn't find it. But we do find Abdurrahman al-Bustami, who also was a very prominent letterist. So this is, I think, an exciting instance of the reception of the science of letters and divine names, because we like to talk about the Picatrix and other texts, but recently we have been working a lot on the reception of the science of letters in the Renaissance, and Kircher is an excellent starting point.
That's great. And another thing that you reminded me of is the idea of jinn, because contemporary esoteric practitioners seem to be very interested and attracted to the jinn as entities. Do you think that there are similarities with the typical ideas of demons that is found in the European, in a more Christian type of context, but also influenced by the Solomonic tradition? Do you think that there is an overlap between the entities of jinn and demons, or are they different entities? Do they have different traits and characteristics compared to the demons from the Solomonic tradition?
Very interesting, very good question. And I know people get excited, as I do, when we talk about jinn and demons and angels. I think this is good because it really tells us about the different shifts that do take place in the medieval and early modern period in the Islamic context. So as I mentioned earlier, in the earlier medieval context, there's this notion of the ruhaniyat, which literally means spiritual forces. And as I mentioned, they are just like volitional forces that transmit astral influences. And you can see similar concepts in Neoplatonism and Stoic philosophy as well. And in other ways, they're like multiplication of the Neoplatonic universal soul, right? So the emanations from the universal soul they flow through the celestial world, and that flow is basically the essence of the ruhaniyat. But also the Ikhwan al-Safa, for example, they do make a distinction between two types of spirits. One are those ruhaniyat, and the other ones are they combine them together, like they're the jinn and the devils. So as I said, the jinn at that early stage were not particularly part of astral magic. But jinn, just to give a very general introduction to them, jinn, the word jinn comes from possibly Jannah, which means insane, or going mad. They are entities who live in parallel to the human world, but they are made of smokeless fire, as they are described in the Quran. They are invisible. They are said to be shape-shifting. Some of them are good, some of them are evil, and the evil ones become the demons. And they are like humans, accountable to God. Some of them are, they adopt different religions. They live a life in parallel to the humans. And as I said, they're mentioned in the Quran. There's a whole chapter in the Quran called Al-Jinn. And in different narratives, they are said to aid in divination. And of course, that they are subjugated by Solomon. And I also can mention that someone like the librarian Ibn Nadim, who wrote a text called Al-Fihrist, where he lists different types of books on the basis of different topics, and he makes a distinction, for example, between astral magic that uses astral forces and adjuration type magic that subjects demons and jinn by adhering to religious obligations, or sorcerers who are like the negative, the bad type, who appeal to demons with sinful act and sacrifices. But you still don't see them being the main agents of magic until, in Islamic magic, to be more accurate, until the 12th century. And this is something that I have been working on as well recently, of like, what happens? There's this new genre of magic that starts appearing in the 12th century that seems to mediate between astral magic, a la the Picatrix, but not letterist yet, but includes things related to subjugating demons. And it seems to me that this is tied in to the integration of Jewish adjuration style of magic. And so in like the Jewish adjuration style magic appeal to supernatural powers, usually angels, but also names, letters, and demons. Usually these entities are addressed in the first person. They use a lot of expressions of restriction. They use expressions like in the name of Bishem, followed by the names of God and names of angels. And they seem to be very similar to a kind of sanctified astral magic, where the ruhaniyat now changed into angels. And it's through subjugating the angels that you can have control over the jinn. And also, what's interesting is that and I use the Ghāyat for an example, the astrology is quite intense. So you cannot be an astral magician if you're not a consummate astrologer. But in this type of magic, there is still astrology, but it's a bit more elementary, and it's more based on day, hour, angel, letter correspondences. And you find also a lot of Quranic material, whereas if you look at Ghāyat al-Ḥakīm, you won't find Quran or verses from the Quran integrated into the practice. But most fascinating is that this type of magic, like Hebrewized astral magic, uses voces magicae, so words that from Hebrew, and that's fascinating. You literally see Hebrew integrated into adjurations. And just to give an example of such text, I'm thinking of Abu Yaqub al-Sakkaki, who died in 1229. He wrote a text called Al-Kitab al-Shamil fi al-Bahr al-Kamil, which translates into the comprehensive book on the complete sea. And if you look at that text, you will find definitely this type of magic that integrates Jewish practices of adjurations. Not necessarily Kabbalah. You won't find Kabbalah, but you'll find practices that were practiced in the local context as well, in the Islamicate context by Jews. So you see why here the Islamicate context, using Islamicate, makes sense. There's also Fakhruddin al-Razi, who died in 1209. He was a prominent exegete and philosopher in a text called the As-Sirr al-Maktoum, the concealed secret or the hidden secret. And there you also find this type of magic where particularly the angelification of the Ruhaniyat. The Ruhaniyat explicitly start getting names that end with the Hebrew El. So, Gabriel, Rahmael, Shemael, and you don't see those in the same prominence in Ghāyat al-Ḥakīm. And in this context, you start seeing the Solomonic references. So it's in the Islamic context, you will struggle finding sources that you can call Solomonic magic in the way that we understand them. We understand Solomonic magic in the European context, but you'll find a lot of similarities. The God's greatest names, expressions like Ahya Ashar Ahya, you will find it. You will find even like the angel Metatron, who is present in an Arabic version of the Sword of Moses, a very important text. So these texts were translated, and the practices, the local practices, I think they were integrated into this 12th century Jewish dash Islamic magic, and it's truly fascinating. And I think from there the Sufis start offering a more Islamic model of magical efficacy through the Sufi context. So the letters become more prominent, and rather than in this kind of magic that is neither letterist nor purely astral that I just described. But this is also work in progress, and I hope to publish soon an article on this as part of a project that I'm a member of, taking place at the University of Exeter and led by Emily Selov. There's information on that project online. It's called the Sorcerer's Handbook, so you can look it up. And we're studying al-Sakkaki's text in particular. But when we say Solomonic magic, we're really talking about the Latin European tradition, which emerged in the 12th and the 13th century. And this is pretty much a Christian type of magic, although it does have non-Christian roots, whether it was ancient Greek or Jewish, as represented by the Liber Radialis. And it's, as you know, it's pseudo-epigraphic, and it's represented by texts like the Ars Notoria and the Liber Iuratus Honori. And it has similar features of this type of magic that I described earlier. But the goal is different. The goal is like power in knowledge and getting intellectual enlightenment. But it does involve inner discipline and purity rituals, which we all also see them in this al-Sakkaki and Fakhruddin al-Razi type of magic. And it has invocations of angels. And of course, Solomon becomes important. So there's similarities, but they are definitely not the same. But this is a very, I think, understudied subject. And it would be great to have more people doing more research on it.
So if you're listening and you're trying to get a PhD on something, that could be
right.
your proposal right there for you, or the topic.
But you need 3 languages. Work on your languages: Hebrew, Latin, Arabic.
we have already put everybody off, but
No. That's a lot of fun, and I will help you there.
I agree. I agree. I've studied many languages myself, so I agree that studying languages is a lot of fun. But I know that it can be intimidating for those who have never learned a second language. But there's always time to start.
Absolutely. And there's always way of getting into it by just like diving into text and getting dictionaries and faff around and then take courses, can be a lot of fun. It's like deciphering.
Yes, exactly. So let's move from astrology and demons to alchemy. So could you discuss the role of figures like Jābir ibn ḥayyān? I hope I'm pronouncing it
Yeah, yeah.
right, in
No,
the
you said
development
it.
in the development of alchemical thought, both in the Islamicate and in the European world.
Sure. Just a disclaimer. I am more of a magic person in astrology than alchemy. So I've dedicated more of my research on the subject of magic and astrology and demons and jinn and such. And so I'm currently studying the Jābirian corpus, but I'm looking at his work on talismans called Kitab al-Nukhab. But just to give more of a background. So when we're talking about Jābir ibn ḥayyān, one of the first questions that will pop up is that who the hell are we talking about? Because there's a historical Jābir. His full name is Jābir ibn ḥayyān, and he probably died in the first half of the 9th century. And he's an alchemist, but also a natural philosopher and mage. And he's also said to be the disciple of the Shia Imam Ja'far al-Sadiq, who died in 765. He's the 6th Imam of Shia Islam. But even historically, if you go back in time, the identity of Jābir was also obscure. Some even historians claim that he didn't exist, but rather that he's a legendary figure. So this is a very contentious subject about who Jābir ibn ḥayyān was, but he was mentioned by Ibn Nadim. Remember the guy I talked about who wrote Al-Fihrist, that like the librarian who wrote this biobibliographical source in the 10th century, and he refers to some treatises supposedly written by Jābir ibn ḥayyān, and he also claims that it was dedicated to some members of the Barmakid family who came to power in 786, but particularly one very influential person called Ja'far ibn Yahya al-Barmaki, who was the vizier of the Abbasid Caliph Harun al-Rashid, featured in texts like the 1001 Nights. So the biography of Jābir is somewhere between a historical reality and legend. But there's no text of what we refer to of the Jābirian corpus that actually has those details. So the attribution of that corpus that we call now the Jābirian corpus to the historical Jābir ibn ḥayyān is very historically ambiguous. But on the basis of a lot of research that took place in the 20th century by prominent historians of science like Paul Krauss, for example, or Holmyard, it is now widely accepted that the what we call the Jābirian corpus is pseudo-epigrapha that was probably produced during the late and early 10th century. So there were a lot of debates about the authenticity of this corpus, and you still have some camps like the prominent historian, the late Fuad Sezgin, who insisted that this corpus did belong to the historical Jābir, which means that it belongs to a much earlier period than we now accepted, which is a very interesting challenge for research. Like, what are the implications of that dating on the development of the occult sciences? And so the corpus is huge, and it contains material on alchemical processes, about the elixir, about also the occult properties of natural things, and a lot about talismans. But also he is famous for, or the corpus is famous for presenting the theory that we call the science of balance. And the science of balance is this mathematicalization of the occult properties, where the author or authors claim that the essence of all natural things are based on numerical proportions, and that if those numerical proportions are known, material can change from one to the other. So the alchemist is not just someone who dabbles with material things, but also is aware of the mathematical essence of things. And so if you know how to manipulate these mathematical or numerical ratios, then you can change one matter to the other, but also, so that's alchemy, but also you can create talismans on the basis of these numerical ratios. So as I mentioned earlier, I'm working on and editing and translating, hopefully sometime in the near future, but I do say that quite carefully, but a text called Kitab al-Nukhab, which can be translated as the compendium. This text has not been studied almost at all. It was dismissed by prominent historians of alchemy because, you know, in the early 20th century, with a positivist kind of approach, alchemy was legitimized as an academic subject of study because of that outdated notion that alchemy is a pseudoscience, that it's the science that led to the proper science of chemistry. You can't do that so much with talismans in that framework. So it was actually explicitly pushed aside as, you know, not a central book in the Jābirian corpus. But in this text, it's all about talismans. It does not have any instructions on how to make talismans, but it's explaining occult properties, and it explains how the science of balance works in magic. And it applies, again, Aristotelian theories of causality to explain that basically making a talisman is an act imitating nature, because in nature, when form unites with matter, and then you have the stars being the causes, it emerges as a thing with power, or or something with occult powers. And so he argues that basically making a talisman is the human equivalent of, you know, creation, or like, let's call it secondary generation, which is quite a remarkable, really, idea. In fact, the author insists that magic is the most authentic science because he claims that when humans saw fermentation, or when they saw spontaneous generation, so this idea that things can generate spontaneously, like bees from cows or stuff like that, that the first act of magic is people seeing these processes and fermenting things. So for him, fermenting is a kind of magic because it is reproducing natural processes and producing new material. So I find that quite fascinating, and I'm glad others did not look at it, because then I can, which is a lot of fun. But since we're talking also about the European influence, when we talk about Jābir, we're also talking about Jābir, or are we? So there is, in the history of alchemy, there's what we call the Jābir problem, which is, again, who is that Jābir? And Jābir is a Latinized name, obviously, of Jābir. But this emerged in the 13th century in Europe, and it became a name given to an anonymous writer, really, who now we refer to as pseudo-Jābir. And in the 13th century, these alchemical and metallurgical writings started popping up under this name. Now, one of the books of Jābir, or rather one of the treatises of the Jābirian corpus, was translated, and it was called the Book of 70, which is a translation of Kitab al-Sab'in. And it was partially translated into Latin by Gerard of Cremona, who I mentioned as one of the main very important translators in the 12th century. But that translation did not have the name Jābir in it. And so when you look at some of the list of translations that were compiled by his student, the students of Gerard, they list the Book of 70 as the Liber Divinitatis de Septuaginta, but they don't include the name of the author. So yeah, all Jābir's Latin works were considered to be Latin by Latin authors, really, with the exception of what I just mentioned, the Book of the 70 and the Book of Mercy as well, Kitab al-Rahma. But there are particular texts that became central to the medieval alchemical tradition that were attributed to Jābir. For example, the Liber Claritatis, the Liber Fornacum. And what's interesting about the Liber Fornacum is that the manuscript, I can't remember exactly where that manuscript is, but it was translated in Spain, and the scribe actually gives the date of this manuscript, and he gives it in the Hijri, so the Arabic year 720, which is equivalent to 1320 AD. But I guess if we're talking about Jābir, we should highlight the Summa Perfectionis, because it was of a particular importance. The text itself claims that it presents, quote unquote, the whole science of chemistry or alchemy. And the author claims to have collected it from all kinds of ancient writings. But what is important about this text is that it pushed to the fore this idea that all metals are composed of sulfur, a unified combination of sulfur and mercury corpuscles. And he describes and justifies the issue of making an elixir. But we also find a lot of influence of this pseudo-Jābir in editions and manuscript that were produced in the 16th and the 17th century. So the reason why I'm saying this is to say that the Jābir situation is a mess with regards to who wrote these texts, but it shouldn't matter really, because it shouldn't matter to just fixate on who is the author historically. Do we have evidence of that particular person existing in a particular time? I think for me, and particularly in the occult sciences, what's important is the construction of authority and authorship. So although Jābir might not be a real person, but his influence is real enough to talk about Jābir and Jābir and Hermes and many others as actual authorities. So that should be what we focus on more than the historical reality of the existence of Jābir and Jābir.
Yes. I also wanted to ask about the Brethren of Purity, but I think you mentioned that already, and the influence that he has had on the on Western esoteric traditions. So, do you want to add anything more on that, on the influence that it has had, or?
Sure. I mean, it's the epistles of the Brethren of Purity. Their influence cannot be underestimated. They're influential on the Ghāyat al-Ḥakīm and influential on so many other occult texts as well. But they weren't translated into Latin and we don't have evidence, at least till now, of their direct influence in the European context, but they were very influential via the Ghāyat al-Ḥakīm, because the Ghāyat al-Ḥakīm copies and transposes a lot of the material in the epistles of the Brethren of Purity, but particularly their epistle on magic and astrological also epistles. So they might not be directly influential, but they were influential through the influence of Ghāyat al-Ḥakīm. But they are absolutely fascinating, especially that we still don't know who they are. That is, the only thing that we have surviving is these 52 epistles, which make up a whole encyclopedia that covers mathematical sciences, natural sciences, esotericism, and the occult sciences as well. And they had this very interesting project where knowledge, especially occult knowledge, is presented as means for esoteric aspiration. So remember when we said that not everything occult is esoteric and not everything esoteric is occult, but for the brethren of purity, the occult has to be mobilized for esoteric purposes. And so for them, this is a project of hikmah, of knowledge, of wisdom, that has to have a comprehensive knowledge of nature and the celestial world in order to become closer to the divine by knowledge, by intellectual engagement. And it's quite a unique text in the way it does that. And it's also expressed a lot of times in pretty elegant ways. But yes, the only translation that we have in Latin actually is an epistle on geography. And I'm not sure, I think it's also not complete, but I'm not sure if it's complete or not, actually. But I think that is the only section, if I am not wrong, that has been translated, their epistle on geography, but not the magic, which is a shame.
So I will ask my last question, and then we will take something from the chat. So if people wanted to start studying the Islamicate occult sciences, where would they start? Because I would imagine for somebody who's perhaps more educated on Western esotericism, it might be difficult to start, and they might feel a bit disoriented. So do you have any advice on somebody who's starting to get a bit more knowledgeable on the subject?
Sure. I mean, we are lucky in the fact that I would say the last 10 years, there's been a boom, an absolute boom in studying the Islamicate occult sciences. You have so many scholars that have been working on this, and we have quite a lot of sources. But like as an entry point, I really do recommend a publication called the Islamicate Occult Sciences in Theory and Practice, and it was edited by myself, by Francesca Leoni, Matthew Melvin Kushki, and Farouk Yahya, and it combines chapters that were based on a conference that was organized at Oxford at the time that I was there. And what is nice about this text in particular, that it was consciously a marriage between study of the occult sciences from the intellectual history aspect and the material culture. And so Francesca Leoni, who curated a fantastic exhibition at the Ashmolean on the Islamic occult sciences. Sorry, I forgot the name, which is very embarrassing. But Supernatural in Islam. I'm so sorry, Francesca, if you're hearing, I'm really sorry. But that is a good text to just get a general idea about what was up to date at that time in manuscript studies, in historical studies, but also the study of material culture and archives. But there's quite a lot out there that I recommend. A quick Google, I think, will show that we have been quite successful in placing the occult sciences quite in a central position in Islamic studies specifically, but also in the study of esotericism at large.
Thank you, Liana. So first of all, I want to thank all those who sent a super chat. Thank you all so much. There's a lot of enthusiasm about you, Liana. Mark says that you are amazing. This contribution is beyond qualifiable value. And thank you all. Thank you, Rachel, for incredible interview and the super chat. S. Mill is asking, can you put these references in the comments or description, please? Yes, I will.
Yeah, I will.
Yeah, if you can send me a list of references, Liana, I can quickly.
That's a great idea. Yeah, that's a great idea. I'll send it to you after the interview for sure.
So yeah, you will see that in the description box. Let me see. Thank you also, Hank. And yes, all of you smash the like button, as you know that that's important. And Lenny saying, both of you do great work. I'm very happy that you're doing this joint discussion. So that's really nice. So I think there's a question. So can you speak about Pseudo-Empedocles and practical theurgy? I'm not sure if it's part of your expertise, but
I would like to know more about what is the reference to theurgy in this context.
Yeah, it's a bit generic, probably.
Yeah, especially when it comes to Pseudo-Empedocles, because there is a tradition in the Arabic context of the Pseudo-Empedocles, who is a little bit different than the Greek origin, because it's quite a subject of debate about the influence of the Arabic Pseudo-Empedocles on medieval Latin philosophy. And I really recommend the work of Daniel de Smet on that context. So if you want to know more, I highly recommend. I think he writes a lot about demystifying Pseudo-Empedocles, but only in the Arabic context, which I'm not sure how it ties in to theurgy. So I would need more details. I'm sorry for any disappointment caused.
No, that's okay. Don't worry. Then Always is asking whose English translation of the Ghāyat al-Ḥakīm would you recommend to read?
Right. Right. So there is a translation, but I'm not going to specify. It's a widely available translation. I'm not going to specify the publishers, but this one is widely available. But unfortunately, it does have quite a lot of issues. I just don't want to call it out because, it's an admirable effort, and I'm not here to diss anyone. But the English translation from the Arabic has not been done yet, but I've been doing that. I know it has taken so long, but that's because I'm working with 32 manuscripts. I thought that I can use the around 20 manuscripts that were known to Helmut Ritter, who produced an Arabic edition in 1933. But looking in archives, knowing people who loves the Ghāyat, ended up presenting my way 32 manuscripts. So that means every time I get a manuscript, I have to collate it. But I have good news. I do have a manuscript. So I'm working on it actually right now. So I hope soon I'll be able to submit it. But this will be based on Helmut Ritter's Arabic edition that, as I said, published in 1933 by the Warburg Institute, but it doesn't have footnotes to elucidate a lot of the material. But I got more manuscripts. However, there is a German translation of this Arabic edition by Helmut Ritter. Helmut Ritter's edition is quite reliable. There are some things that I fixed in it, but that is not to say because it's not reliable. But there is a German translation of this. And there's the Latin translation that was published in the 60s, and it was edited by Martin Plessner. And on the basis of that edition, Dan Attrell and David Porica published a translation of the Latin Picatrix recently, actually. So if you're patient a little bit, it will come out. I'm still working on it. I stopped collating any manuscripts coming my way. I'm just adding them to footnotes, and I'm not revising the entire thing. So soon I will announce that it's complete and it will be going through the review process soon.
Yeah. And a shout out to Dan Attrell, who's another friend from the Modern Hermeticist.
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah, so that's another valuable online resource, guys. We have a follow-up from S. Meal, who says, I believe Pseudo-Empedocles talked about incubation and similar things. So maybe the concept of incubation seems to be particularly interesting too.
Again, I would, is that in the Arabic context or in like what kind of textual tradition? That would help me to give a more comprehensive answer. So is it incubation in the sense of creating a creature? Like if more context, that would be quite quite helpful. Again, I'm sorry for any disappointment caused,
No,
but if you can give a more
give a more detailed, give a more
then maybe
detailed
even Angela,
question.
you can like shoot that question or those details to me, and I can send you whatever I can find out.
You mean even after this in an email?
Yeah.
Yeah.
If you wish.
Yeah, sure. Then we have another question. Can you discuss the relationship between the Western Aristotelian influenced Sufi and the Eastern Advaita Sufi movement, their tension and or cross pollination?
Right. So, can you discuss the relationship between the Western Aristotelian influence Sufi? I'm not sure what this is referring to, actually. In the context that I study, so this is like medieval and a little bit early modern Islamicate context, Sufism leaned more on Neoplatonic emanationist universe than the Aristotelian context. And this is actually quite an observable shift where occult and esoteric discourse at some point was understood through an Aristotelian cosmology, and in Sufism that becomes more based on an emanationist hypothesis and emanationist scheme, because then each layer of the cosmos, so God at the top, and then the universal intellect that contains the ideas of all things, which emanates the universal soul, which gives life to everything, and which then multiplies generation of everything, gives life to individuals. These levels, they get associated with letters and divine names. So it ties in quite well with the lettrist point of view, and you see something very similar in the Kabbalah. So maybe a little bit more detail about what is intended by Aristotelian influence Sufism. I will try to find out, but I'm not sure. I know actually about the connection with an Eastern Advaita Sufi movement, but definitely Sufism in the Indian context is a very important and fruitful context to study, especially with the entanglement of Hindu and Tantric traditions with Sufi practices.
Thank you, Liana. Then Martin is asking if you could give us an example of something that is occult but is not esoteric.
Very good question. Very good question. So something that is occult but not esoteric. I gave the example of astrology earlier because in the Islamicate context, astrology is considered one of the occult sciences. So if you look at Abu Ma'shar al-Balkhi, the introduction to astrology, Kitab al-Madkhal Kabir ila al-Ahkam al-Nujum, you will see that here we have an astrologer who was systematizing, correspondences, astrological correspondences, techniques, but also a theory of astrology. And it was based on Aristotelian notions of generation and corruption. And his idea, which I know to modern astrology is quite controversial, but that the stars are signs because they are causes. And I'm very aware how controversial that is in the modern context. But that was the first step to kind of naturalization of the astral influences. There was no interest in that text particularly about reaching divine truths and getting closer to the divine. It was more dealt with as a science, as particularly on the basis of Aristotelian epistemology, which means that you understand the causes of things by looking at their effects. And the astrologer's job is to categorize effects, movements, and reach conclusions about the causes from there. So in that sense, it's occult, but it's not esoteric. I would say Thabit ibn Qurra, a Sabian who was active in Baghdad. He was a mathematician, astronomer, very established, very important figure. He wrote a text on talismans that was translated twice in the 12th century. He talks about making talismans for protecting your house from scorpions. That was a concern that people had, of course. So he tells you that you take a piece of, I think, frankincense, you chew it, and then you make a figure on a ring that has the image of Scorpio. So you see correspondences, astral correspondences are important. You chew that frankincense, you then press it on that frankincense, and it becomes a talisman that protects from scorpions. There is nothing in that process or in that text that says that in this process there's a transformation or a divinization of one's soul. Now, you can argue that this is all like disciplines of wisdom, so you will have to become a sage, a wise person, which is a fair comment to say, but it was not described in what the Sufis and other esotericists will call as a botany kind of context. On the other hand, you look at talismans made by in Shams al-Ma'arif, for example, or in the works, authentic works by Al-Buni. And it is stressed that you make these talismans, and it could be for things as simple as also to get rid of scorpions, but it is completely dependent on the operator to be someone who is like attained high status in the Sufi path or become a quite established esotericist. And in that sense, the esotericists in that context, they insist that this knowledge of how to make that talisman or how to make other talismans did not come because they investigated things from the natural philosophy point of view, but because occult knowledge came as a revelation from God because of the advancement in the esoteric path. Whereas for Ikhwan al-Safa and for the Brethren of Purity and in the Ghāyat, it's you being a scientist, right? With the idea of science in the Islamic context, it involves wisdom. So it's not just science for science sake, it's for cultivating the intellect. But it's very different than you see it in the Islamic context. So these are some examples that I can give. And you can find that within the same corpus. For example, in the Jābirian corpus, the text that I'm studying, that I mentioned, Kitab al-Nukhab, the author explicitly says that this is not an esoteric text. He says that what I'm doing is explaining to the beginner, to the student, to explain how talismans work and why they work. And he explicitly says that this is utilitarian approach. There's nothing about purifying the soul and entering into an esoteric path. However, he does say that this is a starting point to that advancement. So these things can become esoteric, with the right teacher, with the right master, and with the right aspiration. So even within one program, things can start as just occult and then become occult and esoteric. I hope that answers the question.
Yes, thank you. Asmil is asking, can you give your opinion on Dervish influence on modern Islamicate occultism as part of Sufi mysticism?
Right. So, the Dervish tradition is coming from, a very, mainstream Sufi traditions, right? So when we think of dervishes, we're thinking of the twirling dervishes, for example. And to answer that question, I have to talk about the influence of Sufism on the occult sciences. So I look at Sufism as esoteric path. And as I said, the occult can be esoteric and it can be not esoteric. So when the Sufis dealt with the occult sciences, as I said, the most prominent type of occult sciences was the science of letters and divine names. Of course, the divine names are important elements in a practice that dervishes and other Sufis practice called dhikr, which means remembrance. And it's usually remembrance of God's names, God's attributes, which is integrated into Sufi rituals. And through this dhikr, through this remembrance, the practitioner is basically trying to empty the mind and control the ego by instilling the power of these divine names in their awareness. And so when that became when that took an occult turn, so to speak, that's when the science of letters and divine names become used as an application of the cosmology of the Sufis, which depended on this view that the letters make up, are that like the building blocks, as many of us say, of the universe. So in that sense, Sufis influenced a lot of occult practices in the Islamic context.
Mm. Thank you, Liana. So I've kept you on long enough, but it was really a treasure trove of knowledge. Where can people find you and your work if they want to, which I'm guessing that they will be very keen on doing so after this interview.
Sure. I try to post everything I publish on academia.edu. So I have a profile there with almost all of my publications, and they're all downloadable. So that would be the best place to like access my academic work. I also have an account on Twitter, but it's not under my name. It's to update people basically on my work on the Ghāyat al-Ḥakīm and my translation on the Picatrix, but also it contains other things that I am interested in regarding the occult and also other even contemporary political situations. But that's where I put also an update if you want to know when the Picatrix is out. That's where, or my translation is out, that's where you go. But also, and it's called Ghāyat al-Ḥakīm. If Angela, we can put that on the list of things just so that they know.
Yeah. You can send me everything via email and I will add it in the description box. So you guys come back here in a few days and you will find all the information in the description box.
And I also have a photography account on Instagram with my name, Liana Saif 125. And in that, I try to present my photographic work on the theme of religion in general. So this is where you can get, you can just see my photography. But for my academic work, I highly recommend referring to my academia.edu page.
Thank you so much, Liana. This was such a valuable interview. I'm really pleased.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you so much. And I'm really grateful for you inviting me and for your work.
Oh, that's lovely. Thank you so much.
Yes. And I hope we get the chance to bump into each other and hang out a little bit more.
Oh, yes, absolutely. We've got to have some drinks together and talk all things esoteric and beyond.
For sure. And thanks for everyone who tuned in. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, everybody seems to be super enthusiastic about you and your work. So
excellent. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody who showed appreciation. And thank you again, Liana.
Thank you. Take care.
So to all of you guys, thank you so much for tuning in. And if you want to support my project of delivering free academic knowledge based on peer-reviewed research, having academics here on the channel, and all the fun things that we do on Angela's Symposium, you know how to support me. Everything is in the description box, in the cards, and in the bio. So you can support me on Patreon, PayPal, Coffee. There's lots of ways you can do that. So you will find all the links if you're interested. And also, don't forget to smash the like button if you're watching this live or afterwards. Let me know in the comments what you thought about the interview and whether you have any questions. And yeah, share this video around to anybody who needs to improve their knowledge on the Islamicate world and its influence on the European esoteric traditions. So thank you all guys for tuning in and being here. And I hope that you all stay tuned for all the academic fun. Bye for now.